July 15th, 1410. The sun rose over the fields near the villages of Grunwald and Tannenberg in what is now northeastern Poland, illuminating what would become the site of one of medieval Europe's largest and most consequential battles. Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen, 50 years old and a veteran of decades of crusading warfare, surveyed the ranks of his Teutonic Knights from his position at the centre of the order's formation. The white mantles emblazoned with black crosses stretched in disciplined lines across the rolling terrain, 27,000 men representing the military elite of Christian Europe. Facing them across the fields were the combined armies of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, an unlikely alliance of Catholic and pagan forces that had come together to challenge the order's dominance in the Baltic region. King Władysław II, Jagiełło of Poland, born Jogaila of Lithuania, commanded roughly 39,000 men, the largest army ever assembled in Eastern Europe. What von Jungingen couldn't have known as he prepared his forces that morning was that the military tactics and technologies that had made the Teutonic Knights the dominant power in the region for over a century were about to meet their decisive test. The battle that would unfold over the next 9 hours would determine the fate of nations and fundamentally alter the balance of power in Eastern Europe for generations. The Teutonic Order had been founded in 1190 during the Siege of Acre as a German Catholic religious order dedicated to aiding Christians on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. But by 1226, the order had shifted its focus northward to the Baltic region. Invited by Conrad Van of Masovia to help defend against raids by pagan Prussian tribes, what began as a defensive mission quickly transformed into a full-scale conquest and forced Christianization of the Baltic peoples. The order's methods were brutally effective. They combined the military discipline of monastic warriors with the latest developments in castle construction and siege warfare. By 1283, they had completely conquered the Prussian tribes, establishing a theocratic state that stretched from Pomerania to Estonia. The conquered territories were settled with German colonists. Native populations were either Christianized or exterminated, and a network of formidable brick castles secured the order's control. The capital at Marienburg, constructed between 1274 and 1409, was the largest brick castle in the world, a testament to both the order's wealth and its engineering capabilities. The knights themselves represented the pinnacle of medieval military training. Each brother knight underwent years of preparation, combining religious devotion with martial excellence. They were trained in the lance, sword, and mounted combat from childhood if they came from noble families, or received intensive instruction upon joining the order. The core of the Teutonic army consisted of approximately 250 brother knights at Grunwald, but these were supplemented by several hundred additional knights from allied German states, hired mercenaries, and thousands of well-trained sergeants and men-at-arms. The order's military doctrine emphasized heavy cavalry charges, the shock impact of armoured knights on horseback smashing through enemy formations through sheer momentum and superior equipment. Each knight wore full plate armour by 1410, the most advanced personal protection available, weighing approximately 55 pounds, but distributed across the body in a way that allowed surprising mobility. Beneath the distinctive white mantle, these warriors were encased in articulated steel that could turn aside sword blows and even deflect crossbow bolts at range. Their war horses, specially bred for size and temperament, were themselves partially armoured with steel chamfrons protecting their heads and leather bardings covering their bodies. The weapons carried by these knights had been perfected over centuries of warfare. The primary weapon for the charge was the lance, approximately 12 feet long, designed to be couched under the arm and driven forward by the combined momentum of horse and rider. The technique required precise timing and tremendous courage, as the knight had to maintain formation while thundering toward the enemy at speeds approaching 25 miles per hour. Upon impact, a properly executed lance charge could penetrate shields, puncture armour, and physically lift opponents off their feet. After the initial impact, when lances were typically broken or dropped, the knights would transition to their secondary weapons, the sword, axe, or warhammer, each designed for specific purposes in close combat. The swords carried by Teutonic knights in 1410 were typically longswords, double-edged weapons measuring 40 to 48 inches in total length, designed for both cutting and thrusting. The blade design had evolved to include a sharply tapered point capable of finding gaps in plate armour. The warhammer, increasingly popular by the early 15th century, featured a steel head with either a spike or blunt striking surface opposite a back spike or hook, specifically engineered to defeat the plate armour that was now standard among wealthy warriors. The Lithuanian forces facing the Teutonic Knights at Grunwald represented a very different military tradition. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania had become the largest state in Europe by 1410, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, encompassing modern Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Poland and Russia. This expansion had been achieved not through religious crusade, but through a pragmatic combination of military conquest, dynastic marriage, and strategic alliance. Unlike the heavily armoured Western European knights, Lithuanian warriors relied on mobility, archery, and tactical flexibility. The core of their army consisted of approximately 11,000 Lithuanian cavalry, divided between the nobility who could afford better equipment and the mass of lighter cavalry drawn from the broader population. Grand Duke Vytautas, cousin of King Jagiełło and effective commander of the Lithuanian forces, was 60 years old in 1410 and one of the most experienced military leaders in Europe, having fought against the Teutonic Knights, the Mongols, and various Russian principalities throughout his long career. The Lithuanian cavalry tactics were based on traditions stretching back to the steppe nomads who had influenced Eastern European warfare for centuries. Their primary weapon was the composite bow, a sophisticated piece of military technology constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew that could propel arrows with tremendous force while remaining compact enough for use on horseback. A skilled Lithuanian horseman could shoot accurately at full gallop, raining arrows on enemy formations while remaining out of reach of lance-armed knights. The famous feigned retreat tactic, where Lithuanian cavalry would appear to flee in disorder only to turn and envelop pursuing enemies, had claimed numerous Teutonic victories over the decades. These warriors wore lighter armour than their Western counterparts, typically mail shirts or scale armour that provided reasonable protection while allowing the speed and endurance necessary for their mobile tactics. Their horses were smaller than the Western destriers, hardy steppe ponies that could travel long distances and survive on minimal forage, perfectly suited to the vast distances of Eastern Europe. The Polish contingent of the Allied army, approximately 18,000 strong, represented yet another military tradition. Poland had been Christianized in the 10th century and had adopted many Western European military practices, including heavy cavalry in the knightly tradition. Polish knights at Grunwald wore armour similar to their Teutonic opponents, and fought with lance and sword in comparable fashion. However, the bulk of the Polish army consisted of a feudal levy, men drawn from the nobility and their retainers, supplemented by urban militia from Polish cities and hired mercenaries. King Jagiełło had also brought several contingents of foreign troops, including Czech mercenaries famous for their crossbow skills, and even a small force of Tatar cavalry from the steppes, their presence a testament to the multi-ethnic nature of the alliance. The political situation leading to Grunwald had been developing for years. The Teutonic Order had reached the zenith of its power in the late 14th century, controlling not just Prussia but also purchasing the Neumark region from Brandenburg and temporarily occupying the island of Gotland. The Order's wealth came from grain exports through the Baltic, amber trade, and control of key river routes. However, this expansion had brought them into increasing conflict with their neighbours, particularly after the Union of Kriwo in 1385 had joined Poland and Lithuania in a dynastic union. The conversion of Lithuania to Christianity in 1387, though nominal in many areas, had theoretically removed the Order's religious justification for continued warfare. Nevertheless, the knights continued their reason, the traditional raids into Lithuanian territory that combined military necessity with religious ceremony, attracting noble warriors from across Europe seeking glory and spiritual merit. The immediate cause of the war that led to Grunwald was the Order's support for Lithuanian rebels against Vytautas and territorial disputes over Samogitia, a strategically crucial region between Prussia and Livonia. In 1409, a revolt in Samogitia supported by Poland and Lithuania led Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen to declare war. The subsequent campaign season saw raids and counter-raids, but no decisive engagement. Both sides used the winter of 1409 and 1410 to prepare for a major confrontation. Von Jungingen secured a substantial loan from German merchants and hired additional mercenaries, bringing his army to its maximum strength. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance prepared the largest army ever assembled in the region, gathering contingents from across their domains and securing the neutrality or support of neighbouring states. The march to Grunwald itself was a logistical achievement. The Polish and Lithuanian armies rendezvoused on June 24, 1410, near the confluence of the Bug and Narew rivers, a massive concentration of men, horses and supply wagons. The combined force then marched northwest into Teutonic territory, a column stretching for miles along the primitive roads of the region. Von Jungingen, receiving intelligence of the invasion, made a strategic decision that would prove fateful. Rather than remaining behind the walls of Marienburg, the Order's capital and most formidable fortress, he chose to march out and meet the enemy in the field. His reasoning was sound according to medieval military doctrine. A siege of Marienburg, while likely unsuccessful due to the castle's strength, would allow the Polish-Lithuanian army to devastate the countryside and potentially rally anti-Teutonic forces. A decisive battlefield victory conversely could destroy the enemy army and potentially reverse the entire political situation. The two armies manoeuvred carefully in early July, each seeking favourable ground and trying to determine the other's intentions. The knights eventually took position near the villages of Grunwald and Tannenberg, occupying a slight rise with their backs to supply bases and the road to Marienburg. The terrain was a mix of open fields suitable for cavalry operations and scattered woodland that could conceal troop movements. The Polish-Lithuanian army approached from the south, and by the evening of July 14th the two forces were within sight of each other. Both armies made camp, the knights maintaining tight discipline in their fortified position, the larger allied army spreading across a wider area. The night was tense, as thousands of men prepared weapons, attended to horses and contemplated the coming battle. Priests moved among the Teutonic ranks, hearing confessions and providing communion, while Lithuanian shamans, despite official Christian conversion, reportedly performed traditional rituals for their warriors. Dawn on July 15th revealed clear skies and already warm temperatures, presaging a hot summer day. Von Jungingen arranged his forces in a traditional formation for the era. The centre was held by the Brother Knights and the most heavily armoured allied contingents, arranged in several lines with the Grand Master himself commanding from the middle ranks. The right wing consisted of Prussian vassals and German knights under the command of Grand Marshal Frederick von Wallenrode. The left wing was commanded by Grand Commander Kuno von Liechtenstein and included more Prussian forces and hired mercenaries. The Order's army likely deployed about 20,000 men in the initial formation, with additional forces held in reserve or guarding the camp. Crucially, the knights also had artillery, relatively primitive by later standards, but still potentially effective in 1410. Several bombards, large cannon that fired stone balls, were positioned to command the likely approaches. The Polish-Lithuanian deployment was more complex due to the diverse nature of their forces and some continuing uncertainty about exact command arrangements. King Jagiełło, though nominally supreme commander, was not primarily a battlefield general. The actual tactical command was divided, with Vytautas leading the Lithuanian and associated contingents on the left wing, while the Polish forces on the right were commanded by several nobles including Marshal Zbigniew of Bzizy. The centre included the royal banner and various Polish contingents. The Lithuanian deployment in particular showed their tactical sophistication, with lighter cavalry in the front ranks and heavier forces held behind, a formation that would allow for their traditional fluid tactics while maintaining a solid reserve. The battle began with a peculiar incident that has been much debated by historians. According to multiple accounts, von Jungingen sent heralds to the Polish-Lithuanian lines bearing two swords as an insulting gift, implying that the Allies needed better weapons to dare face the knights. This gesture, known as the Grunwald swords, was likely intended as a psychological ploy to provoke the Allies into attacking across open ground against prepared positions. If so, it partially succeeded. Jagiełło, after consulting with his commanders and attending mass celebrated by his chaplain, ordered the army to advance. The movement began around 9 a.m., the massive Allied formation moving slowly forward toward the Teutonic positions. The Teutonic artillery opened fire as the Allied forces came into range, the bombards roaring and sending stone balls arcing toward the advancing masses. The effectiveness of these early cannon was limited. Their slow rate of fire and inaccurate trajectories meant they were more psychologically intimidating than physically destructive. The smoke and noise were tremendous, and some casualties occurred, but the Polish-Lithuanian advance continued. The Teutonic crossbowmen and handgunners, positioned in front of the main line, also began shooting as the range closed, adding to the storm of projectiles. The Allied forces suffered casualties during this advance, men and horses falling to the missiles, but the sheer size of their army meant these losses, while tragic for those involved, did not significantly weaken the overall formation. As the gap between the armies narrowed to a few hundred yards, the critical moment approached. Grand Marshal Wallenrode, commanding the Teutonic right wing, received permission to charge. This was the moment the Order's military system was designed for, the thunderous heavy cavalry charge that had broken enemy formations for generations. The trumpets sounded, the white-mantled knights lowered their lances, and several thousand armoured cavalry began to move forward at a walk, then a trot, building momentum toward the devastating gallop that would crash into the enemy line. The sound of this charge, transmitted through the ground and air, was itself a weapon. The thunder of thousands of iron-shod hooves, the rattling of armour and equipment, the shouted prayers and war cries of the knights, all combining into an overwhelming sensory assault designed to break enemy morale before physical contact even occurred. The initial target of this charge was Vytautas' Lithuanian wing. The lighter Lithuanian cavalry, seeing the mass of armoured knights bearing down on them, responded with their traditional tactics. They began shooting arrows at the advancing knights, the composite bows powerful enough to wound horses and find gaps in armour, but not sufficient to stop the charge's momentum. Then, as the distance closed to mere dozens of yards, the Lithuanian front ranks turned and began to withdraw. This was either a genuine feigned retreat, one of their signature tactical manoeuvres, or an actual rout caused by the shock of facing the Teutonic charge. Medieval sources disagree, with Teutonic chronicles claiming it was a panicked flight, and Polish-Lithuanian sources describing it as a tactical withdrawal. The truth likely varied across the battlefield, with some Lithuanian units executing controlled retreats, while others genuinely broke under pressure. The Teutonic right wing, seeing their enemies apparently fleeing, pursued with enthusiasm. This was a critical decision that would shape the entire battle. Von Wallenrode's knights charged after the withdrawing Lithuanians, fragmenting into smaller groups as faster horses outpaced slower ones, and the pursuit spread across the landscape. For perhaps an hour, sections of the battlefield descended into a swirling cavalry engagement, with Lithuanian riders alternately retreating and turning to shoot, while Teutonic knights attempted to close the distance and bring their lances and swords to bear. The Lithuanians led their pursuers several kilometres from the main battlefield, past the villages and into the surrounding countryside. Some Teutonic knights caught isolated Lithuanian groups and cut them down, while others found themselves surrounded when apparently routed enemies suddenly turned and counterattacked. Meanwhile, at the centre and left of the battlefield the main engagement was beginning. The Polish right wing, consisting of the better armoured and more heavily equipped knights and nobles, had not retreated but instead stood to receive the Teutonic charge. The impact when these two heavy cavalry forces collided was tremendous, a crash of metal on metal, wood splintering as lances broke, horses screaming and men shouting in fury and agony. The initial advantage belonged to the knights, whose superior discipline and equipment allowed them to punch through the first Polish ranks. The distinctive tactic of the Teutonic charge involved maintaining formation even after initial contact, using the weight and training of the war horses to continue pushing forward, with rear ranks supporting and reinforcing the front. Grand Master von Jungingen committed his central reserves to exploit the apparent success, ordering additional knight formations to charge into the developing melee. The white mantles surged forward, and for a period it appeared the Teutonic tactical system was working as designed. Polish banners fell, noble knights were unhorsed and killed, and sections of the Allied centre began to waver. The royal banner of Poland itself came under severe pressure, with Teutonic knights fighting their way toward this symbol that represented not just tactical importance, but strategic significance. The death or capture of King Jagiełło would potentially end the battle and the war in one stroke. However, the Polish forces demonstrated resilience that the Teutonic commanders had not anticipated. The sheer depth of the Polish formation, with multiple ranks of armoured cavalry supported by infantry, meant that even as front ranks were pushed back or destroyed, fresh forces moved forward to fill the gaps. The Polish knights, fighting for their kingdom and well aware of what defeat would mean, held their ground with desperate courage. Individual combats raged across the centre of the battlefield, knights in full armour grappling and striking with swords, axes and warhammers, fighting in the brutal close quarters that resulted once the initial lance charges were exhausted. The ground became littered with bodies of men and horses, the earth churned to mud despite the dry weather, mixed with blood that made footing treacherous for both men and animals. The Polish command system, despite initial pressure, maintained coherence. Marshal Zbigniew of Brzezy coordinated reinforcements, sending fresh contingents to shore up weakening sections of the line. The Czech mercenaries, expert crossbowmen, found positions where they could shoot into the flanks of attacking Teutonic formations, their heavy bolts capable of penetrating all but the best armour at close range. The urban militia, less well equipped than the nobles but fighting with the determination of men defending their homeland, formed solid blocks of pike and spear that the Teutonic cavalry found difficult to break without suffering heavy losses. The battle in the centre ground on, neither side able to achieve a decisive breakthrough, casualties mounting steadily as the morning progressed toward noon. The critical turning point came with the return of the Lithuanian forces. Vytautas, far from having been routed, had maintained control of at least the core of his command. Whether by design or fortunate circumstance, the Lithuanian withdrawal had drawn a significant portion of the Teutonic right wing away from the main battle. Now, having regrouped and rallied additional forces that had scattered during the earlier fighting, Vytautas led his cavalry back toward the battlefield. The Teutonic Knights who had pursued into the countryside found themselves facing a reformed enemy, and as they attempted to return to the main engagement, they came under attack from multiple directions. The lighter Lithuanian horses, fresher than the Teutonic destriers after hours of combat, had the advantage in mobility, while the composite bows continued to take their toll on exposed horses and men. More decisively, the Lithuanians, who had not been drawn off in pursuit, along with the Tatar cavalry and other allied contingents on that wing, now began to wheel inward against the exposed flank of the Teutonic centre. Medieval battles often were decided by flank attacks, as the close-order formations of the era found it nearly impossible to manoeuvre to meet threats from the side while engaged to the front. The Teutonic Knights in the centre suddenly faced enemies not just to their front but attacking from their right side, where the pursuing right wing had left a gap. The disciplined formation that was the order's strength became a vulnerability, as knights locked in combat to the front could not easily turn to face new threats. Von Jungingen, recognising the developing crisis, attempted to refuse his right flank, pulling back some units to form a new defensive line. But the momentum of the battle had shifted irreversibly. The Polish forces in the centre, sensing the pressure reducing, began to push forward more aggressively. The royal banner, which had been in severe danger, was now advancing as fresh Polish reserves committed to the fight. The Grand Master made the fateful decision to lead a personal charge, gathering the remaining knights of his household and the best equipped warriors he could rally for a direct assault on the Polish centre. This was both a tactical necessity, an attempt to break through and split the Allied army, and a demonstration of the knightly code that required leaders to share the dangers of their men. The charge of Grand Master von Jungingen became the climax of the battle. Surrounded by dozens of brother knights and mounted men-at-arms, all in full-plate armour with fresh lances, von Jungingen led a final desperate assault toward the Polish royal banner. The formation smashed into the Polish centre with tremendous force, and for brief moments it appeared it might succeed. Polish knights fell back before the onslaught, the Grand Master's battle cry reportedly audible across the battlefield as he urged his men forward. But the Polish forces, rather than breaking, compressed and surrounded the Teutonic formation. What had begun as a charge became a desperate fight for survival as Polish and Lithuanian forces converged from multiple directions. The exact details of von Jungingen's death are disputed in various accounts, with different sources claiming the honour for different warriors. What is certain is that somewhere in the brutal melee at the centre of the battlefield, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order was pulled from his horse and killed. Some accounts say he was struck down by a Polish knight named Mstruj of Skrzyno. Others credit Lithuanian warriors. Still others suggest he was killed by an anonymous blow in the chaos of combat. His death was not immediately recognised, given that his full helmet and armour made identification difficult in the midst of battle. But when his body was later found, marked by the Grand Master's distinctive insignia, the symbolic significance was immediate and devastating to Teutonic morale. With von Jungingen dead and the command structure disrupted, the Teutonic formation began to disintegrate. Grand Marshal Wallenrode, still attempting to extricate his forces from the pursuit trap on the right wing, could not restore order to the centre. Grand Commander von Liechtenstein, commanding the left wing, found his forces under increasing pressure as Polish and Lithuanian units that had been held in reserve now entered the battle. The Order's military system, so dependent on discipline and coordinated action, began to fail as individual units found themselves isolated and surrounded. The white mantles that had been symbols of invincibility now became marks for targeting, as Allied forces specifically sought out the Brother Knights, knowing that their elimination would break Teutonic resistance. The battle transformed from an organised engagement into what medieval chroniclers called a great slaughter. Teutonic Knights attempting to retreat found their path blocked by the enemy and the difficult terrain. The tradition of knightly ransom, where captured nobles would be held for payment rather than killed, largely broke down in the fury of combat. Many Brother Knights, recognising defeat but refusing to surrender, fought to the death in small groups, their religious vows forbidding the shame of capture. Others were ridden down as they attempted to flee, killed by Lithuanian cavalry or Polish men-at-arms seeking revenge for years of Teutonic raids into their homelands. The slaughter continued into the afternoon, spreading across miles of countryside as the Teutonic army dissolved into fragments of desperate men seeking escape. The casualties among the Teutonic leadership were catastrophic beyond just the Grand Master's death. Grand Commander von Liechtenstein was killed. Grand Marshal Wallenrode died in the fighting. The Grand Treasurer, the Grand Marshal of Supply, and numerous commanders of individual contingents all fell in the battle. Of the Brother Knights present at Grunwald, sources suggest that between 200 and 300 were killed, an extraordinary casualty rate among what was supposed to be an elite warrior class. The total Teutonic losses, including Allied contingents and mercenaries, were estimated by contemporary sources at between 8,000 and 15,000 dead, with several thousand more captured. The Polish-Lithuanian losses were also severe, with estimates ranging from 5,000 to 15,000 killed, but the Allied army remained coherent and victorious on the field. The aftermath of the battle was as significant as the engagement itself. The Teutonic camp was overrun, with supplies, treasury, and documents falling into Allied hands. More importantly, the psychological impact of the defeat was immense. The Order, which had appeared invincible for generations, had been destroyed in a single day. The myth of the unstoppable Teutonic heavy cavalry charge had been shattered. News of the disaster spread rapidly through Europe, stunning courts from England to Hungary. The implications were immediately clear. The balance of power in Eastern Europe had fundamentally shifted. King Jagiełło, rather than immediately marching on Marienburg, made the controversial decision to pause and secure his supply lines and tend to the wounded. This delay allowed the Teutonic Order time to organise a defence of their capital under Heinrich von Plauen, who had not been at Grunwald and now assumed emergency command. The subsequent siege of Marienburg lasted 2 months but ultimately failed to capture the great castle, partially due to the defensive genius of von Plauen and partially due to disease and supply problems in the Allied army. However, the military situation was irreversible. The Peace of Thorn in 1411 was relatively moderate, with the Order ceding some territory and paying reparations, but the fundamental shift had occurred. The Teutonic Order never recovered its former power. Recruitment of new Brother Knights dropped dramatically as the aura of invincibility was gone. Financial problems, exacerbated by the loss of manpower and the payment of indemnities, plagued the Order for decades. Internal conflicts between German knights and local Prussian populations intensified, eventually leading to the 13 Years' War and the division of the Teutonic state. The Battle of Grunwald demonstrated several crucial military lessons that resonated through late medieval warfare. The Teutonic dependence on heavy cavalry charges, while tactically sound in many situations, proved vulnerable when facing an enemy with sufficient numbers, discipline, and tactical flexibility to absorb the initial impact. The Lithuanian feigned retreat, whether planned or fortunate, showed that mobility and unconventional tactics could counter apparently superior military technology. The Polish demonstration of resilience, maintaining formation under severe pressure, and effectively using reserves, proved that depth and determination could overcome individual tactical setbacks. Perhaps most significantly, the battle illustrated that even the most elite professional warriors could be defeated by a larger, motivated and well-led force, a lesson that would be repeated in numerous conflicts throughout the following centuries. The cultural and political impact of Grunwald extended far beyond military analysis. For Poland and Lithuania, the victory became a defining national moment, celebrated in art, literature and historical memory for centuries. The crossed swords sent by von Jungingen as an insult before the battle became symbols of Polish military prowess, preserved as national treasures. Jan Matejko's massive painting of the battle, completed in 1878, became one of the most famous works of Polish art, its romanticized depiction of the conflict serving to inspire Polish nationalism during periods of partition and occupation. Lithuanian identity similarly embraced Grunwald as proof of their military heritage and contribution to European history, particularly important given Lithuania's later absorption into the Russian Empire and Soviet Union. For Germany and German national identity, Grunwald, known in German as Tannenberg, became a more complex symbol. The defeat of the Teutonic Knights was seen as a tragedy and an unjust assault on German civilization's eastern expansion. This interpretation intensified during the 19th century as German nationalism grew and the conflict was reframed as an ethnic struggle between German and Slavic peoples, a dangerous oversimplification that ignored the multi-ethnic nature of both armies and the primarily religious and territorial nature of the original conflict. The naming of a World War I battle as Tannenberg in 1914, where German forces defeated Russia, was explicitly chosen to symbolically avenge the 1410 defeat, demonstrating how medieval battles could be appropriated for modern nationalist narratives. The military technology and tactics displayed at Grunwald represented a transitional moment in medieval warfare. The heavy cavalry charge, perfected over centuries and representing the ultimate expression of knightly combat, had been shown to have significant limitations. While still effective in many situations, commanders increasingly recognized that cavalry alone could not guarantee victory. The increasing importance of infantry, particularly pike and handgun-armed formations, would continue throughout the 15th century, eventually leading to the pike and shot tactics that dominated Renaissance battlefields. Artillery, still primitive at Grunwald, would develop rapidly in the following decades, eventually making the armoured knight essentially obsolete. The battle can thus be seen as part of the long transformation from medieval to early modern warfare, though this transition took more than a century to complete. The logistical aspects of Grunwald are worth emphasising as they are often overlooked in dramatic battle narratives. The assembly of nearly 40,000 men for the Polish-Lithuanian army represented an extraordinary organisational achievement. Each soldier required food, approximately £3 per day, plus fodder for horses, meaning the Allied army consumed over £120,000 of supplies daily. The movement of this force, maintaining cohesion while traversing hundreds of miles, required detailed planning and a supply system that, while primitive by modern standards, represented sophisticated medieval logistics. The Teutonic Order's ability to field and supply 27,000 men similarly demonstrated the wealth and organisational capacity of the state, making the scale of the defeat even more significant. The personal experiences of individual participants, while often lost to history, occasionally survive in fragmentary accounts. Zbigniew Olesnicki, who would later become a powerful cardinal and effective ruler of Poland, fought at Grunwald as a young knight and was reportedly wounded in the battle. His later policies, consistently anti-Teutonic and supportive of strong military readiness, may have been influenced by his experiences that day. On the Teutonic side, the few brother knights who survived and provided accounts described the horror of seeing their entire command structure destroyed and the desperate fighting as defeat became inevitable. These personal testimonies, preserved in chronicles and letters, provide glimpses of the human experience beneath the broader strategic narrative. The role of religion in framing and understanding the battle deserves examination. The Teutonic Order explicitly fought under religious banners, viewing their warfare as crusading activity sanctioned by papal authority. The Order's ideology held that they were defenders of Christendom against paganism, a justification that became increasingly questionable after Lithuania's official conversion to Christianity in 1387. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance included both Catholic and nominally Christian forces, as well as some pagan Lithuanians and Muslim Tatars, presenting a complex religious picture. The presence of priests and religious ceremonies on both sides before the battle, with each claiming divine favour, illustrates how religion was invoked by all participants. The defeat of the order raised theological questions about divine favour and just warfare that were debated by contemporary clergy and theologians. The treatment of prisoners after the battle varied significantly based on rank and nationality. High-ranking nobles and knights were generally held for ransom, a standard practice that made capturing wealthy opponents financially lucrative. Lower-ranking combatants faced more uncertain fates, with many killed during or immediately after the battle. The brother knights of the Teutonic Order presented a particular problem, as their religious vows theoretically prevented them from being ransomed like secular knights. Some were executed, others held indefinitely, and some eventually released on their word not to take up arms again. This differential treatment reflected medieval social hierarchies and the complex legal and ethical frameworks governing warfare among Christians. The Polish and Lithuanian treatment of prisoners was generally considered relatively merciful by contemporary standards, with King Jagiełło specifically ordering that wounded enemies be given medical care, though this order was imperfectly executed in the chaos following the battle. The battlefield itself became a site of memory and contestation. The villages of Grunwald, Tannenberg and Stembach, which gave their names to the battle depending on which source was consulted, found themselves at the centre of historical debates for centuries. Archaeological investigations in the 19th and 20th centuries uncovered evidence of the fighting, including mass graves, weapons, and armour fragments that provided physical confirmation of chronicle accounts. The construction of monuments and memorials at the site became politically charged, particularly during periods of tension between German and Polish nationalism. The medieval battlefield was thus transformed into modern contested ground, with interpretations of what happened on July 15, 1410, shaped by the political needs of later generations. The military reputation of the Teutonic Knights never fully recovered from Grunwald. While the order continued to exist and even fought significant campaigns in subsequent years, they did so from a position of strategic weakness rather than the dominance they had enjoyed previously. The difficulty in recruiting new brother knights, particularly from prestigious German noble families, meant the order increasingly relied on mercenaries and local levies, reducing their military effectiveness. The financial burden of maintaining the state without the revenue from territorial expansion created a cycle of debt and decline. By 1525, the Grand Master Albrecht von Brandenburg-Ansbach secularized the Prussian territories, converting to Lutheranism and transforming the crusading state into a secular duchy, marking the effective end of the Teutonic Order as a major political and military power. For the Kingdom of Poland and Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Grunwald marked the beginning of a period of expansion and increased influence in Central and Eastern Europe. The Polish-Lithuanian Union, tested and strengthened by the common victory, would continue in various forms for centuries, eventually becoming the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1569. The military confidence gained from defeating the seemingly invincible Teutonic Knights contributed to Polish military achievements in subsequent conflicts against the Ottoman Empire, Muscovy, and other adversaries. Lithuanian military traditions, validated at Grunwald, continued to emphasize mobility and flexible tactics, even as Western European armies increasingly standardized around pike and shot infantry formations. The tactical lessons of Grunwald were studied by military theorists and commanders for generations. The importance of maintaining reserves to exploit opportunities or shore up weakening sections of the line was repeatedly emphasized in military manuals. The vulnerability of pursuing cavalry to counterattack became a standard teaching point, with Wallenrode's pursuit into the Lithuanian trap cited as a cautionary example. The value of combined arms tactics using cavalry, infantry, and missile troops in coordinated fashion, rather than relying on a single arm of service, became increasingly recognized. The psychological dimension of warfare, including the importance of leadership and the devastating effect of losing key commanders, was reinforced by von Jungingen's death and its impact on Teutonic morale. The economic consequences of the battle extended well beyond immediate territorial changes. The Teutonic Order's trade networks, particularly in amber and grain exports through Baltic ports, were disrupted by the defeat and subsequent conflicts. Polish merchants gained increased access to trade routes previously dominated by the Order, contributing to the economic growth of Polish cities in the 15th century. The cost of the war, including ransoms for captured knights and reparations, drained the Order's treasury and forced reduction in the elaborate building programs and cultural patronage that had characterized their earlier period of prosperity. The shift in economic power contributed to broader changes in the Baltic region, with the rise of cities and merchant leagues relative to the declining power of the crusading order. The commemoration and memory of Grunwald evolved significantly over 6 centuries. In the immediate aftermath, chronicles written on both sides presented very different narratives, with Polish and Lithuanian sources celebrating a divinely ordained victory, while Teutonic and some German sources emphasized the numerical superiority of the Allies and downplayed the significance of the defeat. Renaissance historians began to examine the battle more critically, though still through the lens of emerging national identities. Enlightenment scholars attempted more objective analysis, though they lacked access to many primary sources and sometimes relied on unreliable accounts. The 19th century saw intense nationalist appropriation of the battle by all sides, with historical accuracy often subordinated to political messaging. Modern historical scholarship on Grunwald benefits from access to a wide range of sources, including chronicles from multiple perspectives, financial records, diplomatic correspondence, and archaeological evidence. The reconstruction of the battle's course remains debated in some details, particularly regarding the Lithuanian wing's movements and the exact sequence of events in the central melee, but the broad outline is well established. Contemporary historians emphasize the battle's significance not just as a military engagement, but as a crucial moment in the development of Eastern European state structures and identities. The work of scholars from Poland, Lithuania, Germany and elsewhere has contributed to a more nuanced understanding that acknowledges both the real military and political consequences and the ways the battle has been interpreted and misinterpreted for various purposes. The leadership qualities displayed by commanders on both sides offer lessons that transcend the specific historical moment. Grandmaster von Jungingen demonstrated courage and commitment to duty by leading the final charge personally, qualities admired in knightly culture, but his decision to offer battle rather than await siege and his inability to prevent the fragmenting of his formation during pursuit raised questions about tactical judgment. King Jagiellon showed strategic patience by carefully preparing the alliance and assembling overwhelming force, though his battlefield role was limited, and his controversial decision not to immediately follow up victory by assaulting Marienburg has been debated by historians. Grand Duke Vytautas displayed tactical brilliance in managing his wing, whether through planned feigned retreat or skillful recovery from initial setbacks, and his ability to rally and return his forces at the critical moment was decisive. These varied leadership approaches illustrate different aspects of military command, from strategic planning to tactical execution to personal valor. The human cost of Grunwald, while impossible to calculate precisely, was enormous for the era. The death of perhaps 20,000 men in a single day's fighting represented a significant demographic loss for the region. Each casualty was not just a statistic, but an individual with family, social connections, and economic role. The concentration of losses among the nobility and military elite meant the impact went beyond mere numbers, as the death of trained warriors, skilled commanders, and educated leaders created gaps in social and political structures that took years to fill. The wounded, many of whom would have died in subsequent days or weeks from infection and complications, added to the total cost. The psychological trauma experienced by survivors, though not documented in ways modern readers would recognize, can be inferred from the desperate character of the combat and the horror of medieval battlefield conditions. The environmental impact of the battle, while minor compared to industrial age conflicts, was nonetheless significant for the immediate area. The trampling of fields by tens of thousands of horses and men destroyed crops during the growing season. The blood and bodies from the slaughter contaminated water sources. The decomposition of thousands of corpses, both human and animal, posed health hazards for surrounding populations and required organized mass burials to prevent disease. The consumption of local supplies by both armies before and after the battle stripped the region of food stocks. The long-term recovery of the battlefield area took years, with some fields reportedly avoided by local farmers for generations due to associations with death and the practical problem of skeletons and weapons fragments that continued to be uncovered. The technological state of warfare in 1410, as exemplified at Grunwald, represented the late medieval period's apex before the military revolutions of the Renaissance. Plate armour had reached a level of sophistication that provided excellent protection against most weapons, though at significant cost in both money and skilled labour to produce. Weapons had evolved to counter this armour, with heavier crossbows, early firearms, and specialised anti-armour melee weapons like warhammers. Horses bred for warfare were larger and stronger than earlier medieval destriers, capable of carrying fully armoured knights, though still far from the massive draft horses sometimes imagined in popular conception. The logistical systems supporting these armies, from food supply to ammunition, manufacture to medical care, represented centuries of organisational evolution and the accumulated wealth of increasingly centralised states. The aftermath of July 15, 1410 thus rippled across Europe and through subsequent centuries, making the Battle of Grunwald one of the pivotal engagements of the medieval period. The Teutonic Knights' charge, which had broken so many enemies over the previous century, broke instead upon the determined resistance of the Polish centre and the tactical sophistication of the Lithuanian wings. The thunder of hooves and crash of lance against shield that had announced the arrival of Europe's premier military force instead marked its decline. The Lithuanian pagans, so long the target of crusading warfare and dismissed as primitive warriors by Western European knights, had demonstrated that tactical flexibility and courage could counter heavy armour and religious zeal. The white mantles with their black crosses, symbols of unstoppable conquest, became shrouds for a fallen order whose power would never again reach its former heights. The fields near Grunwald, soaked with blood and littered with the wreckage of battle, had witnessed not just the collision of armies but the transformation of a region's political and military landscape, the consequences of which would echo through the centuries that followed.